Hello. Thank you for joining me for another Friday afternoon analysis. I know I wasn't here the past 2 weeks. We had a schedule conflict. I am back. I really want to make these weekly. So I apologize if you've been missing them, but I am really glad that you're here because I love this topic. We are talking about lunar rovers, the unpressurized kind. We're going to talk about the pressurized kind later. But there was an announcement made this week about 3 potential lunar rovers that could someday be driven by astronauts or remotely on the surface of the moon. And if you weren't really aware of this topic, I don't blame you. It has been like a year since this announcement was made, since NASA said that they wanted to have companies bid for this award. And hi, Ross, thank you for joining. So it's been a year and the selections were expected in November. So this is like a 5-month delay here because of, I don't know, budget reasons or something. I don't really know what went on behind the scenes. But whatever it is, we finally have these 3 teams that were selected out of approximately 5 that we know of that submitted. I have a little graphic on the Astrophysical website. I actually posted on social media yesterday, if you want to go check that out, of the people who had announced about a year ago that they were submitting proposals for this selection. And some of them didn't make it, like NASCAR was actually partnered with the company and they weren't selected. But it doesn't mean that they're not going to have some kind of presence on the surface of the moon. Who knows how things will plan out. But these contracts actually have a lot of potential money behind them. There is up to $4.6 billion over 15 years. That is the maximum value of this contract. And by the way, the contract is called the Lunar Terrain Vehicle Services, LTV, Lunar Terrain Vehicle. Acronyms, right? So just to throw that out there in case I say LTV and you don't know what I'm talking about. So that's a significant award, but these companies were not awarded billions of dollars, not yet. These teams, and I'm saying companies and teams kind of interchangeably because there's a lead company that leads a team. All of these are teams of multiple companies. And I'm going to go through each one, so don't worry about it. But they were awarded somewhere in the vicinity of, $30 million. We don't really know the exact amount. We just know that one of these companies in the press release, it was Intuitive Machines, in their press release actually said that they were awarded $30 million as the prime for their initial contract here. These are 12-month studies, approximately 12 months. With NASA, nothing is for certain how long these things take. Do you think NASA will select more than one rover budget planning? I'm going to talk about that. I am going to talk about how many rovers NASA is going to select, because chances are not all 3 of these rovers are going to make it to the moon. Hence the title of this talk, which is who will actually win. It might just be one. It might be one winner that we see driving on the surface of the moon. Don't know yet, but stay tuned. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. So these are initial studies that are being conducted, again, on the range of like $30 million. We really don't know how much all of these primes and the subs were awarded, but that's one figure that was quoted by Intuitive Machines. And so that's a decent amount, but it's not a lot of money when you consider what they're trying to do. When you think about the equivalent, think about the electric cars that were flown during the Apollo era that somebody in the audience will tell me better the history when they started flying the electric cars that are on the surface of the moon. It certainly wasn't Apollo 11. I want to say like Apollo 14 or 15. I don't exactly remember when they started flying. I think it was 2 or 3 missions that they had those cars on the surface of the moon. And it really changed the amount of coverage, obviously, that the astronauts could go to collect moon rocks, to collect samples, to do that kind of geology. And also, these cars for this selection under the Artemis program are meant to also be able to be piloted remotely or, driven remotely. So when you think about, rovers on the surface of Mars, for example, those are all remote from Earth. And that's the equivalent here, is that NASA wants the ability to be able to have these things drive remotely, control it from Earth or control it from Gateway, that's the station that's going to be around the moon, or have astronauts drive them, as we saw during the Apollo era. So that's where we are with this. Again, unpressurized. So that means that it's open to the vacuum of space, because the moon doesn't really have an atmosphere. It has an exosphere. It doesn't really have an atmosphere like we do. So astronauts are going to be wearing spacesuits. That's the image I want you to have in your minds. And there is in the thumbnail for this talk, the 3 images that the companies, the teams had put out there. But they made sure to emphasize that they are still tweaking their designs. So there was a press briefing. And during that briefing, multiple of those companies said that they were still tweaking their designs, really understanding what these vehicles would look like. One of the companies, and I'll talk about this, has a full scale mock-up. And so they have been operating what they think it'll look like in the desert in California. But until it's actually up there, Apollo 15, thank you, Ross. So Ross says Apollo 15 is when they started driving those cars on the moon during the Apollo era. So back to these contracts, approximately 12-month studies leading to a preliminary design review. That's really standard when it comes to space hardware. Then NASA said that they want to select all three, but chances are they're going to have the budget to select one. And this reminds me of back during the selection of the Human Landing System, the HLS, where NASA really expected to have the budget to select two of those HLS, bidders. But then they surprised everyone and only selected one. And there was a big outcry because SpaceX was not expected to win that HLS contract. And then 2 years later, they, after like lawsuits and all kinds of political pressure, they finally selected a second one, which was Blue Origin. And that's why we have Starship, HLS, and Blue Moon. So I feel like this is something like lessons learned from NASA, where NASA's saying, we're not going to select all three most likely. And they're not even saying we want to select two. They're saying we probably only have the budget to select one. I feel like they learned their lesson there, like, suppress expectations because NASA's budget is being squeezed. I don't know if you all have seen some of these budgets that are being put out by Congress and the White House, but NASA's budgets are not doing so great right now. The future is not looking good. It looks like an actual cut to NASA. And so when we're thinking about what can NASA commit to in the future, it has to be really conservative with the funding that it's being given by Congress. If you are a U.S. citizen watching this and you feel like you want to contact your elected representatives and tell them that it's important to you to support NASA, I highly encourage you to do so. Ross says next year for the LTV is a bid price to be important. Yeah, so price will probably be a factor. These companies, these teams will say how much they expect these vehicles to cost, to not only to build and launch, but to operate, and that could be a factor. Also, technical ability and loads of other things that they have in their criteria when they do these selections. Now, in terms of operations, NASA wants these vehicles to operate for 10 years. And it might not be one vehicle that operates for 10 years. The example given was it might be 10 vehicles that operate for 1 year. But NASA wants operations for these vehicles to last a decade. So whether it's one vehicle or 5 vehicles or 10 vehicles or whatever, NASA wants it to operate for a decade. And when you're thinking about the day-night cycle on the moon, and thinking about these recent lunar landers, which have either survived or not survived the lunar night, this is a tall order. There was an article put out by Ars Technica yesterday. I can put it in the description for this talk later. I posted it on social media yesterday. It talked about how nuclear propulsion is right now being considered to get any kind of operations through the lunar night. It's a 2-week cycle. And when you're thinking about the coldness of space, well, the moon is essentially that cold. I mean, it has its own, we say that the moon doesn't emit its own light, but it actually does emit heat. So it does have a teeny bit of infrared, but not much. It's very cold during the night, very hot during the day. And so that kind of temperature gradient, and especially when it comes to hardware, the vehicle cannot typically survive those kinds of cold conditions without some kind of heating element. So for example, the Chang'e 4, is it, that's been continuously operating on the surface of the moon for, how long has it been? Oh my gosh, I just posted about this a few weeks back, but I can't even remember. So it's been operating for continuously, essentially, for several years now. That's the Chinese rover. They had a lander and a rover. U-2 is the rover. And that has been on the surface of the moon operating continuously because it has its own heating system. When it comes to that Japanese lander that landed this year, Slim, that one also has survived, to the surprise of the Japanese. It survived these long lunar nights. It survived 2 lunar nights so far. But Intuitive Machines, IM-1, did not survive the lunar night. So when you're thinking about these vehicles operating for 10 years, whether it's 10 years continuously with one vehicle or something else, you're going to need some kind of heating component. Intuitive Machines is the only one that said in their press release, let me just confirm that it was Intuitive Machines, because I might be good. Oh, no, I'm sorry. It wasn't. It was Lunar Outpost. Lunar Outpost was the only one that said in their press release that they're expecting not only to survive the lunar night, but to operate during lunar night, which tells me that they're expecting to use some kind of power source that can It's not just a battery system. There's a heater or some kind of heat component as well. Chang'e 4 on the far side of the moon for 5 years. Thank you, Ross. 5 years. Yeah, Chang'e 4 is the lander, and then Yutu-2 is the rover. And 5 years continuously on that day-night cycle. I mean, it's really impressive. We haven't really seen that before. So that's what these vehicles, of course, are larger than Yutu-2. So it's going to be more challenging to keep all of their components operating. Now, in terms of the winners, I did hint here, I was talking about two of them. Intuitive Machines, they have won with a team called Racer, Reusable Autonomous Crewed Exploration Rover. Lunar Outpost has the Lunar Dawn. And then Astrolab has Flex, Flexible Logistics and Exploration. And Flex actually announced 2 years ago, Astrolab announced 2 years ago that it is flying Flex on a Starship mission currently scheduled for 2026. It's been currently scheduled for 2026 for 2 years now. So my guess is it won't be 2026. I actually talked about this about a month or two or three ago, where I was talking about different missions, commercial missions that have already booked Starships. And this is one of them. But we don't know what priority is going to be given to this. However, since SpaceX does need to demonstrate uncrewed missions to the surface of the moon for its own expectations as well as for NASA, my guess is they actually might put higher priority on Flex because it's an uncrewed mission that they can demonstrate that Starship can land safely on the surface of the moon. And I'm going to get into these companies and these teams in a little bit. I do want to finish talking about the contract, though. So let me see, where was I here? NASA is the prime customer, but NASA does not want to be the only customer. So it's kind of the change that we've been seeing with NASA for a while now. Think about clips and cargo delivery and crew delivery to the International Space Station. NASA wants to be the prime, the anchor, but it expects these commercial companies to have commercial customers. And so NASA said yesterday, was it yesterday? I'm sorry, time right now. NASA said in the press briefing that it expects to be like the 75% customer for these rovers, or vehicles, I should say, but 25% should be customers coming from the commercial sector. So when you think about what that means, that doesn't necessarily mean commercial astronauts. It could mean commercial astronauts. It could be lunar tourism will pop up more quickly than we think. But it could also mean uncrewed, right? These things will be operating remotely. It could be scientific instrumentation. It could be collecting samples from, I think all of these vehicles have arms, robotic arms to collect samples. So it doesn't necessarily mean that commercial astronauts are going to be driving on the surface of the moon anytime soon, but it could mean that eventually. That's a possibility for the future. And let's see. There's some stats here. Travel at least 15 kilometers per hour. And I apologize, fellow Americans, I did not translate that to miles per hour. Traverse 20 kilometers on a charge and support an 8-hour spacewalk mission. So that's pretty decent. Like, I'm kind of impressed if they managed to pull that off. I'm really impressed. So when will these be delivered? They're targeting prior to Artemis 5. So Artemis 3 is the first human landing mission that is currently scheduled for 2026. Very unlikely to happen in 2026. I'm thinking 2027, 2028. So then Artemis 4 will be after that. And then somewhere between Artemis 4 and Artemis 5 is when they're thinking that these vehicles will be put on the board. Ross says commercial customers on the moon could eventually be private prospects or miners. Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I would expect that, right? So when you're thinking about the ways to make a profit on the surface of the moon, which is what commercial companies would be interested in, it's of course data and scientific instrumentation and government customers, but it's also things like resources. And NASA, the US government has already established in law that the companies can own the materials that they mine. That's now US law, that's Luxembourg law, that's within the Artemis Accords. So all the Artemis Accord signatories have sort of abided by that or agreed to that. It's controversial, no doubt about it, whether or not you interpret the Outer Space Treaty sovereignty clause to mean that you can't mine and sell resources from the moon, but according to US law, you can. So that's how that's going to turn out. Now, I do want to get into the specifics of these vehicles. Intuitive Machines, Racer, they have a team of AVL, Boeing, Michelin, and Northrop Grumman. And I do love the fact that these non-space companies like Michelin, General Motors, I'll talk about Goodyear, they are coming on board. And it's not necessarily new because the lunar vehicles during Apollo, also I think General Motors and Goodyear were involved with those too. Again, historians can correct me, but I'm pretty sure. So I think it's cool that there's non-space companies like Michelin that you would not necessarily think of that be involved in this kind of effort, but they have been, formally involved in this team. Let's see. Intuitive Machines deploy the rover via Nova D lunar lander. So if you remember earlier this year, it was Nova C that landed on the surface of the moon during IM-1. Nova D is a slightly larger lunar lander. So these are larger vehicles. They're going to need to be landed by larger landers. And they want to be able to replace the tires and other components of the rover as needed in situ. Lunar Outpost, the Lunar Dawn. It's a team conducted by Lunar Outpost, Lockheed Martin, General Motors, Goodyear, and MDA Space. Now, Goodyear specifically will be providing tires, obviously. GM will be doing EV battery technology, chassis, and suspension development. And then MDA will be doing the robotic arm and robotic interfaces. It will be, again, the only one that mentioned it'll be operational during lunar night, not just surviving lunar night, but operational. I don't know if the other teams are planning that. Reconfigurable cargo bed that allows for changing of payloads with robotic arm. And that's really the only details they gave there. I wish they'd said more about that. And then Astrolab, they also go by Venturi Astrolab. They are doing Flex along with Axiom Space and Odyssey Space Research. If you don't know Odyssey Space Research, they're a small company in Houston. Axiom Space is also in Houston. They're doing spacesuits. They've got among other things, they've got a contract with NASA to do spacesuits along with Collins Aerospace. They both got those contracts. And so Axiom Space specifically is contributing the design of the vehicle's interface for crew and spacesuits. So that the Flex vehicle will carry 2 suited astronauts, accommodate robotic arm to support science exploration, perform robotic cargo logistics. Again, I wish they'd said more about that. Maximum combined rover and cargo mass of more than 2 tons. And initial mission to the moon is planned for 2026, as I mentioned, a Starship mission. I would not be surprised if that's delayed, but simply because we don't really know what SpaceX's priorities are going to be in terms of Starship and how quickly they can get that operational. I do think Starship will become operational in terms of like getting to orbit this year, but when is it going to get to the surface of the moon? I don't know. So we're just going to have to see. And that's really the only details that these companies gave, because again, they were talking about how they need to do these 12-month studies to really finalize their design, and also they're competing against each other. And when you've got companies that are competing, there's going to be another selection, and they probably don't want to give too much away. So as much as you and I really want to know more details, next flight in early May. Yes, thank you so much. The next Starship flight, early May. The FAA has not approved that yet, but that is currently the hope. I want to see it fly. I really think they probably will get the really good orbit and at least one reentry, one part reentering, hopefully the most important part reentering. But anyway, this is off topic, but Starship is exciting. Where was I? Oh yeah, these companies, they really want to compete to win this final NASA mission, because what we're seeing here is proposals for concepts, right? These concepts are becoming more real. There's hardware involved, but who knows which one of these is going to end up on the surface of the moon? It's not going to be all 3. Very unlikely to be all 3. It might be 2. It might be that one team wins the NASA contract initially, and then NASA has the funding later to award another one, just like they did with HLS. They initially awarded it to SpaceX, and then they chose Boeing 2 years later. It might be that one of these companies or teams decides that they're likely, but you never know. It could be that the Department of Defense, which has more money in space than NASA does, is able to eventually kick in funding for this. It might be a foreign government and a partner is able to contribute, because while I'm pretty sure all of these companies are US based, haven't looked at every single company. I'm pretty sure, MDA, is MDA Canadian? Someone tell me if MDA is Canadian, but pretty sure that all these are US based. However, you never know when there's going to tie in a company that's from another country. For example, Starlab, which is a company that is, a concept that is being put together by NanoRacks, which is now Voyager Space, brought along Airbus to have that European component so that they can more easily compete for European money. ESA or EU, which believe it or not, EU is involved in space as well as ESA. two different entities actually, but it's strange. But in any case, Airbus is a European company, and so there was that initial decision made to bring Airbus on board so that the company can compete with European dollars as well as American dollars. So you just really never know how these things are going to plan out. For right now, we can expect that there's only going to be one winner. Now, I was on a panel back in February with the CEO of Astrolab, Jarrett Mitchells, and he was showing really cool videos, which I think are here on YouTube, about their tests with Flex in the Death Valley in California. And he invited me to see the headquarters one day, but I haven't been able to get back over to Pasadena to check them out. But it is really cool. And they might have a leg up in terms of the fact that they've been operating their technology. But every single one of these companies that's either a prime or a sub has really good space experience, like Lunar Outpost with Lockheed Martin. I mean, Lockheed Martin has fantastic space experience, right? Intuitive Machines just landed something on the surface of the moon, and they're partnering with Boeing. Boeing, yes, Boeing's going through issues, but Boeing also has fantastic space experience. Northrop Grumman is also part of that team. Northrop Grumman has fantastic space experience. So you really cannot say at this point which of these companies is going to win. There was somebody on X today or yesterday that was telling me that they all suck. I think they're all awesome. I think that I want them all to win. I know people on all of these teams and all these companies, and I'm cheering for them. They're not all going to win. But I think that no matter what happens, we're going to see astronauts driving around the surface of the moon. Now, I want you to pay attention to the fact that these are unpressurized, but NASA's also planning a pressurized vehicle. And in fact, it's a partnership with JAXA, the Japanese Space Agency, and Toyota, and that will be announced next week. April 10th, I think, Thursday. There's actually who was it? Some representative from JAXA, from the Japanese government, who's going to be coming to the United States for that announcement. So stay tuned if you're curious about pressurized vehicles. That is, astronauts can go in without wearing spacesuits. And you might have seen these concepts from, like, I don't know, 5 or 10 years ago, a while back, where NASA was actually starting to test this themselves, where they had a pressurized vehicle with EVA suits on the back that astronauts could then get into the EVA suits from inside the vehicle and then disconnect their spacesuits from that vehicle and do an EVA. So they could take their spacesuits along with them. And it's just a really cool concept. So I'm looking to see what that announcement is next week and how soon that is to fruition. That'll be later, is my guess, because that's going to have a lot more moving parts. And to my understanding is that because it's a government partnership and not like a commercial competition like this is, yes, there's Toyota involved, but I think it's probably slower. That's my understanding. MDA is based in the United States and Canada. Okay, thank you, Ross. Interesting. Do I have a preference? Oh, I don't think I have a preference because I think they're all awesome. My preference is that I want to go to the moon and drive around on one of these vehicles. I don't know if I have a preference. Pressurized concept vehicle on display at Kennedy Space Center. Very cool. Yes. I think it was Johnson Space Center that is the prime on that, though. I didn't realize it was on display at Kennedy. That's pretty awesome. That's all I have for you. This is a audience interaction here. So those of you who aren't able to tune in live, put your comments in there. I'm also taking suggestions on topics, but next week I already got it picked out. I'm talking about recycling and reusing space hardware. So we have learned a lot about the dangers of keeping hardware in space, whether it is operational or derelict, and especially if it's derelict, it can collide and cause a lot of issues with space debris. But we're also learning some problems with deorbiting. For example, things that don't fully burn up and then hit houses in Florida, or the fact that the atmosphere is changing composition due to the fact that we are deorbiting space hardware. And so I want to talk about some of the future concepts that, I actually have some colleagues that are working on reusing, repurposing material in space, whether it's actually just reusing the space hardware as it is or somehow melting it in a furnace and reusing the materials themselves. So stay tuned for next Friday's topic there. And I'm also taking suggestions, comments for future topics as well. Thank you, Ross. Thank you, Pritesh, for joining me and everyone else who watches after. You all have a wonderful Friday.